Good morning. Welcome to Primetime at Bethel University Library. Primetime is a collaboration between Friends of the BU Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus. And what we do is celebrate and share with the community classroom experiences in the classroom, research outside the classroom, study abroad, lots of different ways that students learn and that faculty and students work together. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have a couple of advertisements. One is to remind everybody about the exceptional research project that is going to be awarded or recognized and given an award by the Friends of the Library. They're accepting applications for a $250 library research prize, and the deadline is coming up. It's February 15th. So there is information on the library website, and there's displays in the library, and I noticed that there are posters kind of throughout this building. And you can also ask any of our librarians for information. We will have a prime time next week on February 12th. We're going to welcome Jay Rasmussen and Dan Swenson. They are both from the Education Department, and they're going to share a rapid-fire exchange of teaching tips on a lot of different topics for all disciplines, all class sizes, all levels. So no matter what, there will be something for you next week. So I really encourage you to come. Today we are welcoming 2 Edgren Scholars. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Edgren Scholars Program. It's something that we really value because it brings faculty and students together to do research. It is named after John Alexis Edgren. He is the founder of what was now Bethel University, started with 1 student. Edgren's vision for Christian higher education is evident in so many ways, and our Edgren Scholar Program is just one of them. One of the key educational principles that Edgren had, that he articulated in the 19th century was, quote, "The relation between teachers and pupils shall not be that of commander and subject, but one of true friendship and helpfulness." It is in that spirit that we established the Edgren Scholars Program. So this morning I'd like to introduce to you 2 people from the Business and Economics Department, Dr. Dmitri Medvedovski and Andrew Rynen. And they did research, as you can tell from the title, on Lithuanian family economics. They also worked in collaboration with Dr. Kirk Allison from the University of Minnesota. So it not only connected one of our faculty members with students, but also reached beyond our Bethel community. So let's welcome them and hear them share their research.
All right, I was asked to speak loud, and I will try to do that. Thank you for coming out here this morning and sharing your precious time with us, so you can hear what is dear and near to our heart. Basically, I started to work on the Lithuanian research project, in 2010. And originally, we wanted to use my sabbatical in 2010 and collect data, first-hand collection data. And one of the reasons why we were interested in this was there are a couple of major problems when it comes to looking at what is really happening in less developed countries. One of them is some data is not available, and the other problem is the data that is available subject to serious distortions. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. But before I go into an example, I wanted to recognize one thing and make it very clear that the research for me was a journey. And as many journeys that we take in life, the most important that I enjoyed was people that I took this journey with. And one of them was my dear friend, Dr. Kirk Allison. He is a director of human rights and health at the University of Minnesota. So we wanted to collect the data from Lithuania because we wanted to address the issues that were interesting to us. Specifically, there were 4 different avenues that we wanted to take. One was family economics. We wanted to understand how people in Lithuania choose to spend their time with children. Second was related to education and religion. And that's something that I wanted to address this morning, because I know that it's a very diverse audience, and I wanted to speak about something that would be relevant to some extent to everyone. So we studied how education is actually impacting religious practices in Lithuania. The third paper that we were focusing on was related to personal finance, that is personal debt and information technology. And the final one, right on the avenue of Kirk Allison's specialty, related to health outcomes. So there are 4 pillars that we built this research upon. Originally, we wanted to take one pillar at a time and move sequentially. However, thanks to Edgren scholarship, we got an addition, and that was a student, Andrew, that was very enthusiastic to become a member of the team, to join the research. And as every joining, it became a marathon, because we started to work those 4 projects concurrently, simultaneously hoping that Andrew would be just a real serious asset. So Andrew is showing up to run this marathon, all excited as every kid should be. And what happens is he brings a lot of his camping gear. So let me just dwell on this allegory a little bit. Because when you run a long-distance marathon, it's important to have enough water and run light. Andrew brought his tent, his pillow, his swimming goggles, just anything that you can imagine for a good long camping. So, and basically I said, Andrew, all those stuff that you take with you take a lot of commitment in terms of time and effort. And I'm concerned that you will not make it, with us. So after a while, he had to leave his camping gear behind, and the main thing that we all made it successful. So we finished all those 4 projects, and what I'd like to focus your attention today on one striking findings that you may find, hopefully you will find intuitive and useful for your own self. One of the findings that was really striking to me was the relationship between education and religious practices. Specifically, what we were able to find that the more educated people tend to attend church more often, but when it comes to devotion time, it is actually negatively related. So that brought me into a path of a lot of contemplation. Basically, what I was interested to understand, what does that mean and why this is happening? Apparently, using economic jargon, and I'm going to play it very safe here, many economists explain our choices based on opportunity cost perspective. So we make our choices based on what our best alternatives that are available. So whatever we give up is basically determines the price of what we embrace at the present time. So when we apply this opportunity cost perspective, this economic theory, to those choices, the more education, the more we all devote our lives to education, so this is relevant to us, to the very bones. And at the same time, we want to make sure that in my classes, I try to strike a balance that education and intellect will not come at the expense of spiritual devotion. And the findings that we made with this research is actually indicates that the higher educated people tend to attend church more often, but they practice less devotional life. Somehow, the prayer time and reading religious literature as it was defined in our research by devotion life was not as rewarding for more educated people. Now, this is sort of difficult for me to embrace, because I can't imagine to educate my students and know that that could actually be a stumbling stone for their devotion. So what is it? How do we reconcile this finding? Because I certainly don't want to find myself in a position of providing education at the same time distancing my students away from their devotion. That would be a disaster, and this is not something where I want to do. So what we hypothesize that the religious practices, whether it comes to attending the church or prayer or reading religious literature in solitude, is very much like any other choice, subject to our opportunistic behavior. Somehow we perceive our religious practices, including church attendance, prayer, and reading religious literature, as opportunistic. So, in other words, from opportunity cost perspective, it costs us more to pray than go to the church. In other words, it is not as rewarding, and this is that came to me as a disturbing, because I was thinking about the parable when Jesus actually got very angry, and it doesn't happen to my recollection very often. So when he came to the temple, he saw those tables where people were very opportunistic. They bring their goods to trade with others, and they were opportunistic in terms that this is the crowd place. This is where they can make a profit. So it strikes me that we all bring our own things to the church. You know, some people go to the church because they may feel lonely. Some people go to the church because they want to have a relationship. Other people go to the network, business network in the church. You see, and the data that we found is actually supporting the fact that church attendance is opportunistic behavioral choice from economic perspective, where prayer and reading religious literature in solitude actually becomes more expensive, and therefore people do less of it. So how do we bring the education to the level where we can at least make sure that whatever we do in the classrooms is not going to be preventive, or should I say, would not make prayer and religious devotion expensive. And this topic is beyond the scope of this presentation. So what I want to leave you today with two things. One is what we do without education doesn't matter. Second is, apparently, more educated people are more elaborate when it comes to setting up trading tables. You see, they are more opportunistic. Do I want to make my students more opportunistic? No. So our classroom experience is not just about making students more intellectual, but it has to do something, one way or another, making them better people, and making those choices in such a way where they, when they confront the choice, like all of us, and they will make a choice in favor that is dear to all of us. So what we do in the classroom can make behavioral choice of our students or our own choices in the future either very opportunistic in favor of church attendance, or could inflate the price for the devotion time. So again, it's been on my heart lately, and it's important. It's one of the most important findings that we have made, how people make their decisions. So the last thing I'm going to say before I introduce our Andrew, who was sometimes asset and other times liability, as every normal and healthy kid should be. So I guess the question for economists is asset exceeding the liability? And I'm not sure I have an answer to that. So we are not done. The problem of collecting the data. In Lithuania, like in most less developed countries, I'm just giving you a small example so you can appreciate what that means and the importance of the data collection in terms of accuracy and properties. In Lithuania, tax evasion is part of the lifestyle. So what does it mean? It means that the firms pay their employees in two ways. There is an official paycheck, and there is a cash that is stacked in the envelope and neatly, given to the employee under the table. So the official data is reported to the government as what people on average make in Lithuania. But this cash component that often exceeding by threefold of what official salary is not reported. So the research that is often available through the government websites or public sources or even the World Bank might be not including at best the real lifestyle and what is in actuality taking place. So if you build your research and you engage in elaborate econometric techniques to analyze the data, it is going to lack credibility simply because it was not inherently representative. So I have a very big budget for my sabbatical, $0.00, that allowed me to do my best effort to collect the data. I worked with a local university. In fact, it was a psychologist where we borrowed some technique to collect the data from the respondents. Because the idea was to make it so we don't put respondents at risk where they report expenses exceeding their income. And at the same time, we will retain integrity of the data collection as much as possible. So the thought that I want to leave you with is education doesn't matter. And when it takes place in our classroom, it's not just related to our own experiences and experience of the students, but for the future and how we perceive our choices, including religious practicing, church attendance, and devotion life. And sadly enough, it's not happening right now. it's not happening right now based on our findings in terms of in favor of devotional life. Something must change. So let me introduce to you my beloved assistant, Andrew Rynen, and he will guide you through a very interesting statistics.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming today. My name is Andrew Rynen, like Dr. Medvedovski mentioned. I'm a sophomore here at Bethel, pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Accounting and Finance and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. Ultimately, I plan on using my education to run a business in a closed country to both gain access and enable others to gain access to new business missions with me. I find economics extremely fascinating, especially behavioral economics, and I think it will be extremely helpful when I work internationally. After taking Principles of Economics with Dr. Medvedovski, I was looking for more ways to continue my education in the field of study of economics. I had talked with him multiple times outside of class regarding anything from the impacts of taxes on charitable contributions to the effects of sunk costs in decision making. Through class and conversations with Dr. Medvedovski, I can see a significant change in my decision making just from the understanding of what the true costs are and the relevant factors for the decision. And so when Dr. Medvedovski told me about the Edgren research grant, I thought it was a great opportunity to continue studying economics. And now that Dr. Medvedovski gave you that background information, I just wanted to give you guys a few things that I learned as a result of this research. Before we go in, just before we go into the individual papers here. First of all, I'd like to say that there are quite a bit differences between different cultures, as you can imagine, and because of that, many assumptions you have to be careful with in order to apply them internationally, which at times I did not always realize, but I think I'm much more cautious of this now. And then the other thing that really surprised me was I visited Spain, Belize, Japan, and through those travels I learned some about the culture, but the research of Lithuania has brought back a whole new aspect to the culture that I would never have picked up on had I visited there, or maybe even lived there for years. So that was great to see, and I think because of that, moving forward, it's going to allow me to research a country before going into it. Let's see. And then, additionally, this research has given me more of an interest in research as a whole. I've already been talking with a friend, trying to think of new ideas to research. I mean, it may not be everyone's favorite idea for spring break, but I think it would be reasonable. But I'd say probably the biggest thing that I learned from this was just how cautious you have to be about research as a whole when looking into other research papers, making sure their assumptions are correct, and especially with the little information that was on Lithuania, and then that which was relevant, and then that which was in English. You had to make sure the reasoning is sound, and like Dr. Medvedovski mentioned, there may be data that's skewed because of tax evasion, basically. So moving on, we'll start going into the first paper, determinants of Lithuanian paternal and spousal time allocation with children. There we go. So what seemed interesting to me was the differences between paternal time allocation and spousal time allocation. Throughout Europe, the spousal time allocation tended to vary, which made it a little bit more difficult to compare it than to Lithuania from that aspect. But paternal time seemed to be much more consistent. And then one thing that I thought was really interesting was that more time spent by one parent tends to be compensated by more time that the other parent spends with the child. Sorry, that was meant to be more time working, compensated by more time that they spend with the child. And then generally this kind of goes back to the whole opportunity cost aspect. More educated parents still tended to spend more time with their children despite having a higher opportunity cost to spend that time with them, which granted, no one's going to want to give up time with their child, but it did seem interesting that there was that difference there. And I think as time goes on, this research is going to become more and more important as there's been more focus recently on looking at the quality of life versus just production of each nation, this is where this research tends more towards. So for our first model, we had paternal time allocation with children for the dependent variable. And then explaining that was family monthly income, monthly paternal consumption of alcohol, and self-reported health status. For the second model, we looked at the spousal time allocation. And for the third was meant to check to see if the effects of the spouse's time were complementary or substitutionary. So our findings from this were that for the first model, that all the health-related factors were significantly negatively related. As you can imagine, the consumption of alcohol and poor health may make it a little bit more difficult to spend the time with the kids. And then also there was a slight effect for after-tax income, positive, and this may be a little bit skewed by the economy that's not clearly reported, but it still does give us some good information there. For the second model, we found the spousal time to be complementary to paternal time allocation. And then in the third model, we found that paternal time allocation was complementary then to spousal as well. And one thing that was really interesting was the addition of age for every year. I believe it was about 70 minutes fewer time that the parents spends with the kids for every year they age. So some of the limitations, probably the biggest part was just the size of the sample that we had was relatively small compared to what would be ideal. And then we are also operating under the assumption that the area that the survey was conducted in is then applicable to Lithuania as a whole. So for the second paper, some of the background information there. So basically, it looked at internet use among different religious groups. As you can imagine from like websites like Desiring God, the Gospel Coalition, I mean, you can go online and find out a lot of information about different faiths, get better clarity about your own beliefs. And so we were interested in seeing how each religious group varied in that. So for our first model, I'm sorry, I think I might be talking about the wrong group. This.
He's very nervous. It's very apparent. Andrew is the student who has excelled in this research, and I can attest to this personally. He is the person who is asking to have a heavy load, but finds out very quickly that it might be too heavy for him. And that's the way he learned a lot of how to balance things, as many of us. So he asked me to carry a lot of load for this presentation, and I allowed him to do that. But he started to be nervous about 8 months ago. So you can imagine that it was exponential endeavor for him. So what I wanted to make sure that we'll take this opportunity to graduate Andrew as the scholar. And he is being very contributive, and he has done a lot of work. And I wanted to make sure that today is his celebration. Celebration as a researcher, as a true Edgren scholar. So if you give him a little support, I think that would be great.
All right. So from this, I think I know this. Some things that I found interesting was the contributions the church has to debt accumulation and just economic performance overall. There's a paper that we found that talked about more churched areas and areas where there's higher church attendance as well, tended to have lower bankruptcy rates, likely because of a couple factors being the safety net that the church can provide, and then also just the kind of the business aspect, the networking that it provides as well. And so that's kind of going along with this first model here. You see the Catholics accumulate more personal debt than other respondents. Unlike the U.S., it's a little bit more difficult to gain access to credit and get loans. So we're thinking through this, that it was largely because of the large Catholic population in Lithuania allowed them to gain access to funds, and then they would have more personal debt, but then that allowed them to do other work as well. Then move on for time here. All right, so this paper, Lithuanian Fraternal Health Behavior, Alcohol, and Religion. While it's not all that surprising, it is interesting to see research that explains some of the variation in alcohol consumption by the religious group and what is normally deemed acceptable by the religious group. Yeah, so other believers and Protestants consume significantly more alcohol than that of Catholics. We think that this is largely more like a Lutheran group, and it's going more off of the group's tendency to approve of general alcohol consumption or not. So there you see the other believers and Protestants consume significantly more alcohol than Catholics. Prayer, or trying to touch a little bit on kind of like religiosity's impact on the consumption of alcohol. From the aspect of prayer, it was not found to be significant, but more time spent at work was significant. And then the health condition as well. So to our knowledge, this is one of the first studies to examine alcohol consumption in this region in regards to religious affiliation. So that was kind of neat to get into, but yeah. So for this final paper, this is probably the one I found the most interesting. Dr. Medvedovski did touch on it a little bit already. But it looked at the effects of education on church attendance. So with church having both economic and spiritual benefits, it's kind of interesting to take a look at then what are the predictors for that church attendance. So for our first model, looked at the church attendance being explained by religious confession, monthly hours of prayer, and reading religious materials, education, and weekly time spent with children, weekly work hours, age, and alcohol consumption. And then for the second one, it was fairly similar, but it looked at the devotional life, as Dr. Medvedovski put it. And so what we found was Protestants had a higher church attendance than that of Catholics. Monthly hours of prayer and reading religious material did significantly impact church attendance. But what was really surprising was the effects of education, and I think that is largely due to the networking aspect. And then for the second model, it got to the point where it showed that lower time spent on the outside religious activities as the education increases. And I think that reaffirms the point. And there were some limitations in regards to these more religious articles, largely because of the large population of Catholics and smaller sample size. We really didn't have much clarity. For example, other believers, we didn't have it broken down to, like, say, Jewish believers or things along the lines of that. So further research would be great to look into that, but we still can find some good information there. And is there any questions, I guess?
I've got one question on the alcohol. Is that example of culture to where in the United States I would expect Catholics to consume more alcohol than Protestants and others, and so is it because of where it's at in Eastern Europe and Lithuania that you see this reverse effect on that? Is that part of the explanation, or is there no explanation necessarily for that one?
There's some interesting data on alcohol consumption and general attitudes across religious denominations in the United States, for example, and they tend to divide it up in terms of being sort of general abstainers or versus general acceptors on the one hand, and then sort of differentiation in terms of what sort of drinking is okay or not okay within that. And one of the elements was that within American Lutheranism, acceptance of drinking more generally, even in the United States, is higher than, say, in certain evangelical circles, Baptist circles. So there's some consistency, but it was a little bit surprising. And of course, in a European context, also wine, or if you're in France or somewhere like that, it's much more sort of a cultural norm. Of course, Lithuania is also a Baltic country, and somewhat, Baltic and Soviet bloc countries are somewhat famous for alcohol consumption in general. But the fact that the Lutherans and some of the Protestants were actually drinking at a higher level was interesting and was a little bit surprising. So you do see differentiation also in the American data in terms of what do you see for general acceptance, and also what kind of drinking takes place. And when you drill down into it in terms of very abusive drinking versus just social or community imbibing, if you will, you find some very interesting differentiation. So you can have some groups that are fairly low tolerant, but they have maybe higher abuse in certain areas than even those that are more sort of socially including that as a part of cultural practice. But
I just want to add to this that in Europe, the consumption of alcohol perceived differently than in the United States by religious groups. So what does that mean? That if there is a consumption of alcohol among the Protestants, it's more subdued and underreported. It is sort of a cultural phenomenon where in Europe it's more accepted, and therefore their willingness to report what is actual consumption is actually supporting that.
And then from sort of a health economics or health perspective, there is also the relationship with a negative coefficient on health versus drinking versus consumption. And so there's this question of is the health lower because there's more drinking, right? Or going the other way, do people that have more health problems and things like that, do they self-medicate right through drinking in a compensatory fashion? And that's something that one has to tease out with other sort of more complicated analysis. But it is quite striking that the health gradient was important. And you sort of see that popping up, time with children. Also, obviously, if you're very ill, you're not going to be able to be spending as much active time with children, for example. So that was interesting. One thing that was on the with the time with children that was interesting, which was on the screen that could be brought up a little more, was that there wasn't the same level of compensation between the additional hour worked with the children for the males to spend time with children versus the females, and so there was sort of an uneven substitution. So that's also quite interesting. Right. Yeah.
You said that, like, in the studies that you did, the more education the participants had, the higher the rate of attendance at church. Is that correct?
Right. They had in the sample, we had gradation all the way from some high school, basically some technical school out there. Right. In the sample, those that had higher education were actually attending the churches more. And so then one of the questions is, now you also have a different culture because the Soviet Union is a post-Soviet, right? Official atheist, indoctrination for many years, but not necessarily what's going on on a cultural level. The question is, why do people, if you're more educated, why do you go to church more?
I'm just wondering because I've heard multiple times in several books that the uneducated tend to be higher churchgoers in the United States. I'm wondering if that's a European phenomenon, that the more educated go to church in Europe.
In Europe, generally no, but also you have a rebound of religious practice in post-Soviet areas, except with perhaps the exception of Poland. And Poland, even during the Soviet period, had very high, quite relatively high religious practice. And so you have sort of a more general secularization taking place in the whole of Europe, in Western Europe in particular. So this doesn't necessarily hold here. But one of the questions, the economically interesting question is, okay, if people who are more educated go to church relatively more, but they pray less and they do less sort of devotional engagement, which you might call spiritual disciplines or something like that, why is that? And one of the things, like Andrew was saying, is this question of opportunity cost. Is it because my time outside, my market value time outside, is worth more if I'm more highly educated, right? So I'm giving up more in terms of, say, a financial return if I'm spending more time in prayer, or what is it? The thought that we had and Andrew had was that there is sort of this thing. Well, in German they call it vitamin B, Beziehungen, which means connections. In part, that there's this social networking aspect that educated people also use the church context for, in a way that less educated people don't. You see what I mean? So it's not just how much are you attending or participating, but what are what we would call the externalities. Okay, the spiritual externalities or the economic or the social externalities, the extra benefits that one gets out of this.
Just to spin off from this, in the United States, education is often considered as a proxy for income. The higher education you have, especially when there's a lack of data of income, then they would proxy that as the income level. So from economic perspective, you have, the more money you make, the more expensive it is for you to give something instead of. So if people perceive church attendance as a network opportunity, then they would tend to make their time more worthwhile, if you will, given the fact that it's more expensive for them to spend time on anything else.
Thank you so much for your presentation today. I appreciate you being here and sharing